All right. We're going to round out our study of the Victorian period by looking at Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his beloved character Sherlock Holmes. This character, Sherlock Holmes, was born in the Victorian period, and so we really can't study the Victorian period without looking at Sherlock Holmes. And we need to ask the question of how and why has Sherlock Holmes become a cultural phenomenon? Um, But with this, we're looking at, for the first time in this course, genre fiction. And so we're going to talk about the differences between literary and genre fiction. And Conan Doyle was not someone who was part of the canon, not someone who was in the earlier versions of the Norton Anthology. But the cultural phenomenon in Sherlock Holmes has brought Conan Doyle and his Sherlock Holmes stories into relevance. Um, so the question is, do they have literary value? Do they have the kind of literary value that makes them a classic? Or are we only studying them because Sherlock Holmes is a cultural phenomenon? And is a cultural phenomenon like Sherlock Holmes worth studying? Those are the questions we're going to attempt to answer as we close out the Victorian period by looking at what is perhaps one of its most popular characters. Just a little bit about Conan Doyle first. His father was a civil servant who wished to be an artist, and his failures as an artist led to depression, alcoholism, and he was eventually committed to an asylum in the 1880s. But his mother supported her son's passionate interest in reading and writing, and even was able to make enough money to send him to school. Um, in school at age 16, he rejected Christianity and became an agnostic. And he eventually went on to medical school. In medical school, he had a mentor named Joseph Bell, he in part based the character of Sherlock Holmes on. Because Bell could look at a patient and not only diagnose what was wrong with them, but also their medical and family histories. He basically got to know people by looking at them and interacting with them in his short encounters as their doctor. And so, as someone who could look at a situation and immediately assess it and learn all these things about people, that's where that part of Sherlock Holmes' character came from. And that's really, I would argue, one of the most defining parts of Sherlock Holmes' character. After college, after medical school, Conan Doyle established a medical practice in South Sea, which is like this seaside resort area in the south of England, in 1882. And his first home story came out in 1887. So in that area, he had a dearth of patience. He had all this free time. And that's when he began writing the Sherlock stories. Much like Shaw, Conan Doyle lived well into the 20th century. And so he saw things like World War I. And he wrote most of the Sherlock stories in the 1880s and 1890s. I should say most of the ones that were popular. The last real popular ones, Hound of the Baskervilles, came out in 1901, but he kept writing other Sherlock stories that aren't quite as famous all the way until the 1920s. During that time, he was married twice and had 5 children. But his life took tragic and strange turns later on. In World War I, one of his sons, as well as one of his brothers, and then 2 of his brothers-in-law were all killed. And so that was very traumatic. And some critics argue as a result of that, but for whatever reason, he turned to occult spiritualism later in life and actually took part in seances. So he's a rather interesting figure, and he produced a really interesting character in Sherlock Holmes. But let's take a closer look at Sherlock Holmes and see why this character is so interesting. What's really great about Victorian fiction is it was often published in these journals. The Sherlock Holmes stories were typically published in one called The Strand, and they were usually accompanied by these illustrations. So I'm going to try to intermix those illustrations throughout the presentation. To understand why Sherlock Holmes is popular, we have to talk about the differences between literary and genre fiction. Genre fiction did not really exist before the Victorian period. But in the Victorian period, you saw the emergence of a mass reading public where the middle and working classes became educated and could start reading. And so it was no longer just poetry and drama, it was fiction and novels. And so you had the rise of the novel, which we've talked about due to the emergence of this mass reading public. but along with it, the emergence of genre fiction. So, what did the mass public want to read? Well, with genre studies, you have patterns, certain trends readers like. And those trends, those patterns eventually form a genre. And then you write fiction to specifically contain, consciously, to specifically contain those trends and patterns. You operate within a genre. And by doing that, you have, to a certain extent, the possibility of a more guaranteed readership, the fans of that genre. And so, as the Victorian period progressed and more people read, you had the emergence of genres. Now, to the point in the 21st century where you have all different kinds of genre fiction, and to the point where there's become this division between genre fiction and literary fiction, where many scholars argue that writing to the conventions of a genre, specifically including those patterns and tropes, limits one in a way that prevents them from achieving what the more literary fiction, the classics that we study, the things we've mainly studied in this class, what they can achieve. Genre fiction, by dint of its nature, by writing conforming to a certain genre, one limits oneself off from achieving true literary significance. So genre fiction is immensely popular, but has less literary significance, potentially. We're going to debate that. Oftentimes, genre fiction reinforces cultural values. So, in other words, if you have a mass reading public, you might want to cater more to Victorian standards rather than subverting them. So, something like Mrs. Warren's Profession is challenging a lot of the Victorian standards for women. And genre fiction, if it's meant to appeal to the masses, might more want to uphold those values rather than challenge them. So, this is not the only way to look at the differences between genre fiction and literary fiction, and it's not an absolute comparison. But typically, scholars see genre fiction as reinforcing cultural values and literary fiction being more subversive of them. Again, there's always exceptions. So, along these lines, one would ask, why study genre fiction? Well, it reveals the cultural context, and we begin to learn more about that time period. But what else? Um, it also, these works are incredibly popular, so we can learn really significant things by studying them and seeing why they're popular. Sherlock Holmes is a cultural phenomenon. I mean, how many movies, different shows are out there? We can't look at something like Sherlock Holmes and not ask why, and then learn something significant by asking why. So you actually have whole departments at universities devoted to genre studies. But in having those departments established, the universities immediately create a division between literary and genre fiction. Is that right? Does genre fiction offer something more? Should they be split? These are the questions I'm looking to hear from you on. Um, so, what does Sherlock Holmes do? How is it an example of genre fiction? Well, with our specific story, the speckled band, it assuages Victorian anxieties over a few things: colonial contamination and uprising, also deviation from gender norms. So, Holmes is a rational Western hero. He's very Western in his presentation compared to the villain Roy Lott, who's irrational. You know, he's prone to these bursts of anger, and he's otherized. The term other means to intentionally mark someone as different from the norm. And we've already studied empire. So he's very much identified with the colonies and as being, you know, not British, not traditionally Western. He's more Eastern. And so that might cause Victorian readers to see him in a different light. You have this ever expanding empire, and you have things like the Indian Mutiny, the Afghan Wars, of which Watson is a veteran, and you have Victorian people who might fear that the colonies will rise up. And so Holmes's ability to defeat Roy Lott assuages those fears. You also have the idea of colonial contamination. All of these different goods were being imported from the East, from the colonies. And if you remember to the last lecture on empire, the Victorians believed the people in the colonies were inferior and that they needed to be educated in the English way. That was the imperial mission we talked about last time when we were studying Kipling. And so people kind of wondered or worried, if we get all these spices and things from places like India, are we going to become like Indian people? Will we be colonized, so to speak, through bringing all of this Indian stuff into our country, like, for instance, Roy Lott's animals? And so what makes Sherlock Holmes popular, we're going to see, is as a rational, logical being who, anytime there's a question, in this case, it's the question of how was this girl murdered, his ability to provide a logical, rational answer to that kind of satisfies all the questions enables the detective genre to assuage public fears and public concerns. So that's why Sherlock Holmes is so popular, and that's why we have this detective genre that's become perhaps the most popular genre of any genre in fiction and film and television, because you have, in any society, you have concerns, you have anxieties. Um, but if you have a problem, a case, a murder mystery, for instance, that represents those fears and anxieties, you then have a logical, rational, heroic detective that provides the perfect answer. You then have closure, containment of those issues. The public feels at ease. You sell a lot of books that way. And so that's what we see Holmes achieve. And we're going to see how specifically it happens in the story now. Here's a picture of Roy Lott. And one of the things to think about with him is that, in addition to embodying the East and these other things we're about to talk about, he's also a great villain. And so he has to be a big, imposing figure to present a suitable challenge to Sherlock Holmes. Part of the genre is Sherlock Holmes is this impressive figure. He's incredibly intelligent. He's above average. He can figure out these things that the average person can't figure out. And so, to make it an interesting compelling narrative and sell the books, you have to have an imposing villain here, someone who's really going to challenge Holmes. So here's some quotes that describe Roy Lott. This is Helen when she's first in the office talking to them. My name is Helen Stoner, and I am living with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, Roy Lotts of Stoke Moran. The family was at one time among the richest in England, and the estates extended over the borders into Berkshire in the north and Hampshire in the west. In the last century, however, 4 successive heirs were of a dissolute and wasteful disposition, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Violence of temper, approaching to mania, has been hereditary in the men of the family. In my stepfather's case, it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. So, one of the major transitions all throughout the Victorian period, especially at the end of it, though, was the disappearance of this aristocratic class. We talked about the transition from a rural to an urban society with the rise of industrialization and capitalism. And so you had the rural laborers, the working class in the rural parts of the country moving to the city for work. And you had the estates in the countryside on which those workers worked. You had the landed gentry, the upper class, who didn't have to work because they had workers on these estates who would pick the apples or whatever was growing there, and they'd make money off of that. But with the change in the economy, these states no longer produced money, and the aristocratic class eventually disappeared. And so Roy Lott is kind of a relic of this disappearing aristocratic rural class. You see this in Downton Abbey, if you've watched Downton Abbey, where they had daughters are marrying meat packers from America because this rural landed gentry can no longer support itself. So Roy Lott is a relic of this disappearing class of society. So he's old, He's out of date, and he needs money. That's his main motive for the murder and the attempted murder, and so that shows kind of the disappearance of this class of society. Um, but Holmes represents a new class of masculinity, a new form of masculinity in the 1890s, where he is, how shall I put this? He's intelligent, he's rational, he's independent, self sustaining. He doesn't need an estate or workers to sustain him. And so, almost kind of like the new woman, but as represented in a male. And so, he provides this fresh, new perspective that can challenge Roy Lott. And that's part of how his character is appealing. And by associating Roy Lott with this outgoing way of life, Conan Doyle's appealing to his readers in the 1890s who have seen that transition and now see that class as outdated. Also, there's this idea that he's prone to these violent outbursts. He's perhaps losing his mind. That shows he's not rational like Holmes, and that's a very intentional comparison. That makes him clearly the villain and Holmes clearly the right hero to defeat him. You also have that violent mania intensified by his long residence in the tropics. So he's then associated with the East, with the Orient, and in a very negative way. We'll see that develop on the next slide. Here's an example of one of his violent outbursts. Here, the idea of him being associated with the East continues. The idea of using a form of poison, this is Holmes explaining how he killed the girl and tried to kill her sister. The idea of using a form of poison, which could not possibly be discovered by any chemical test, was just such a one as would occur to a clever and ruthless man who had had an Eastern training. So, again, he's associated with the East. He's got the animals from the East, the gypsies, who have long been marked as the other in Western society. So he is not Western like Sherlock Holmes. He's from the East. He's from the colonies. Even if he's originally from England, he's now been, as we talked about, colonially contaminated by them, and he's using weapons from there. So Roy Lott represents what many Victorians feared, that British people in going to India or in using Indian goods and things that came from there would become more like Indian people, rather than Macaulay's idea of making Indian people like British people. And so you have Roy Lott representing this societal fear. But then, as we talked about on the previous slide, Holmes has the ability to defeat him and contain that fear for the society. Here they're meeting with Helen in their office, and you can immediately see the contrast between her and Roy Lott, which is important because on this next slide we're going to talk about gender, which in addition to the empire is the major issue from the Victorian period that this story engages. So there's not much feminine agency here, especially if you want to compare this to Mrs. Warren's profession. Here, Helen's describing her mother and family history. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roy Lott entirely while we resided with him, with a provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. So, her mother has money, and Roy Lott's her stepfather. Her original father has died, so the money is the reason why Roy Lott marries her. And now that the two girls have come of age and they're ready to marry, he has to kill them to keep the money. If they get married, they'll take that money with them to their marriage, and he'll be financially ruined. So, in other words, women equal property. And what happens here is women are otherized the same way, that, in a similar way that Roy Lott is otherized. They're not part of the mainstream patriarchal society represented by Holmes. This case, their only thing of value they have to offer is the money from their family. Going on with this idea, towards the end, Watson says, it is not in his narration, Watson says, it is not necessary that I should prolong a narrative which has already run too great a length by telling how he broke the sad news to the terrified girl, how he conveyed her by that morning train to the care of her good aunt at Harrow, of how the slow process of official inquiry came to the conclusion that the doctor met his fate while indiscreetly playing with a dangerous pet. So this completely, Watson's narration completely marginalizes the only female character in the story. She's the feminine other, and she's silenced here. She doesn't even get to tell her ending to the story. She's scared here, um, terrified. They take care of her. They put her on the train to go see her aunt. So it'll turn out okay for her, we're supposed to assume. And then in the official inquiry following the events, the action of the story, they determine that the doctor died while playing with a dangerous pet. So there's not even any mention officially. Only Holmes and Watson know the truth. There's no official mention that he killed one girl and was attempting to kill another one. And so the female characters are completely silenced here. And so this is, written roughly around the same time as Mrs. Warren's Profession. And so you have the new woman figure, you have characters like Mrs. Warren, characters like Vivi, who are representing very real types of people in society. So if you think of traditional Victorian values, which we've discussed at length at this point, there's another Victorian figure here that the story assuages, and that's of the new woman, the non-traditional woman threatening traditional gender roles. And this again is contained. We're the only one in the story. They rescue her, but they completely contain her. There's no feminine voice in the story. So we've seen here how the villain of the story, as well as the damsel in distress of the story, represent these societal anxieties, and how by having this Western, logical, rational hero, the concerns those characters raise are contained. That's often what genre fiction does, and that's what the detective hero, through his abilities, specifically enables the author to achieve. And one last thing I'll mention before we turn to the final slide is if you look at these quotes, these are not brilliant, stunning quotes. They're facts and details. We're essentially analyzing plot. We're technically using the language, but these are plot details. This is the amount of money she has per year. That's what we're getting from this. And so another thing that separates genre fiction from literary fiction is you don't have the brilliant language that you see in Dickens, or that you see in Emily Bronte, or that you see in George Eliot, or that you see in Christina Rossetti. You have this very straightforward language. You have details, which we can analyze. We can make interesting assertions, but it doesn't have quite the same literary significance. So let's continue to discuss. Here's Holmes getting ready to deal with this. I've already said this, but to coalesce my thoughts, the Speckled Band uses the heroic detective figure to assuage Victorian anxieties over colonial contamination and uprising, as well as the threat to traditional patriarchal standards posed by the new woman figure. Why is this important? The ability of the heroic detective to assuage societal anxieties in nearly any context or culture has led to the enduring popularity of Sherlock Holmes, as well as the massive success of the procedural crime genre in general. So if you look at other more recent Holmes stories in film and television, or other detective stories, like I said, this is the most popular genre. It's personally one of my favorite genres to read. The detective stories continue to do this. Now, as I said, it is one of my favorite genres to read. So I'm not being a hypocrite here. I'm not saying don't read Sherlock Holmes. That's not the point of this lecture. The point is to see the place something like Sherlock Holmes has in literary history, and to examine the why of why it's influential, the how and why. And so what do we take from this? Well, there's a few things. The reputation of Sherlock Holmes has lived well beyond Conan Doyle's stories, which are full of holes. I loved Sherlock Holmes growing up. I love detective stories, but for a long time, I never actually read the original stories. I saw the films and the shows. And so when I then became a Victorian scholar and actually read Sherlock Holmes, I was like, the stories themselves aren't that great. You have a guy here who's able to train a snake using milk and a whistle. That's not very plausible. Um, but he's really the first detective. Edgar Allan Poe's detective appeared before him, but he only had 3 short stories, whereas Conan Doyle produced this volume of Sherlock Holmes stories. So he really created this figure that's become representative of the genre and what it can do, and that's the legacy, and that's why Holmes is popular. But the stories themselves aren't that great. Um, but what I wanted to ask here, I forgot I wanted to make that point. What I wanted to ask, as I was transitioning from the previous bullet point, was can genre fiction transcend its genre and offer literary significance? I've spent a lot of my time studying great works of literature, 10,000 hours, but I've also spent a lot of time reading detective novels, probably even more than that. So, is that worthwhile? I mean, I think there's other things of value besides just reading literary fiction, but can genre fiction transcend its genre? One way is there's gaps in the closure. In other words, um, Roylott and the new woman may be contained by Holmes's ability to solve the mystery, but the subversive, challenging things about those figures are still introduced to us. And even though the story has this very unambiguous, closed off ending, the fact that those ideas were there in the first place introduces them to the reader, perhaps pushes the reader to more. So, in any kind of genre fiction that presents social problems and then neatly contains them, we can look for gaps in the closure as ways of further investigating what more significant ideas the works might present. And then finally, Holmes is perhaps not the best example, but or perhaps not the original Conan Doyle Holmes stories. Perhaps the show Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch pushes the envelope more and tries to transcend its genre. The point I want to leave you with in talking about genre fiction is this. I personally, others would disagree with me, but I personally don't believe that a writer who's tailoring his or her work to a specific genre can't also achieve great literary significance at the same time. I don't think Conan Doyle does, don't get me wrong, but I think other authors can and do. I think Dickens does that. Dickens very much represented the cultural values of his day. That's why he was popular in the Victorian period. But he's also widely studied now if you look at the number of articles and books that have been published by scholars on him. Because while representing the values of his day, he found very subtle ways, as we saw when reading The Signal Man, to critique and challenge other things. If you look at the pieces of genre fiction that you enjoy reading, because I think we all do to some extent, you'll probably find other ways that those works present interesting ideas that transcend their genre, or ways they critique and challenge cultural values rather than just supporting them. Um, so keep that in mind as we move on from the study of genre fiction. But with the emergence of genre fiction, with the emergence of a mass reading public, with the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of capitalism, we have a transition to a very different period of history, of literary history, to a more modern period. And as Victorian society met the new woman, as the 1890s marked a shift away from very traditional, very rigid, very moral cultural values that were embodied by Victoria and Albert, what did writers do next? How did writers who weren't constrained by Victorian morals and values engage with the complexity, the trauma of living in a new modern world that was defined by things such as World War One? That's what we're going to look at next time. Thank you for indulging me in going through the Victorian period with me. The 20th and 21st centuries are great, but the Victorian period, I think, will always be the most fascinating period of literary history to me. So, thank you for that. Here's one last picture. Here's the monkey that Roy Locke keeps. Enjoy.